Could we see major changes coming to the New York Islanders? We're also going to be taking a look at some latest trade talk around some other key pending unrestricted free agents, including Philip Forsberg and John Klingberg and a few other players as well, including Tyler Toffoli of Montreal and Vladimir Tarasenko of the St. Louis Blues. Plus, we have news from the NHL waiver wire, and the NHL has a major COVID issue. Could we see a pause in league play? We'll discuss all the latest news coming up next. Welcome back to another video here at Top Shelf Hockey. As I mentioned, we have a variety of NHL news and rumors here today. We might as well kick things off with the dominant story today, and that's all the news surrounding the COVID situation, not only in the NHL, but a lot of other sports and really around North America and the rest of the world here as this new variant takes hold of the current situation. Now, ultimately, we had 23 players placed in NHL COVID protocols over the last 36 hours. That is a substantial, amount of players. We saw the Hurricanes in the Wild game tonight postponed. The Carolina Hurricanes ended up with a bunch of positive tests. Of course, they played in Western Canada recently. We just saw the Calgary Flames get shut down. They had more people from their team enter the COVID protocol today, including Hanifin, Lucic, and Monahan. Of course, the Hurricanes, after playing the Flames, also had stops in Edmonton and Vancouver. The Canucks had a few people have positive tests today as well. I believe Luke Shen and Lamico, I believe, was the other. The Edmonton Oilers do have a couple of situations as well, including Ryan McLeod and head coach Dave Tippett, who's not going to be coaching tonight in the Oilers game against the Toronto Maple Leafs. The Bruins had a few, including Marchand and Craig Smith. Matthew Barzal with the Islanders entered COVID protocol. Devon Taves and the Avalanche and others. And the Hurricanes, like I said, had a few, including Sebastian Aho, and I believe it was Seth Jarvis and somebody from their staff enter protocol in Vancouver before they left to head back to the United States, where they were supposed to be playing in Minnesota. So they had to leave those guys in COVID protocol. So when you're in that, you have to isolate where you are. Now, the Hurricanes themselves are working on a plan to hopefully get them back to the United States so they can go home and be home for the holidays. Because once you enter those protocols, it takes a while before you have to, test out and get through the isolation period, and we're not really all that far from Christmas and the holidays and the holiday break. So the team appears to be working on a contingency plan to get those players, basically like a medical evacuation, if you will, to hopefully get them home to take care of the rest of what they need to do in Raleigh. So we'll see where that goes, but certainly not a good situation today in the NHL. There is word tonight that the NHL and the PA is going to be having a meeting this evening, which was scheduled for tomorrow. We'll get bumped up a day with a lot of the league and doctors that are that work with the PA in the league around all their protocols and managing this situation. So we'll see what comes from that. Right now, all the NHL insiders are reporting that they're all being told that it's not likely that we're going to see an NHL pause or shutdown or anything league-wide. Right now, obviously, the NHL is still trying their best to get through this. I mean, if we have teams shut down, they're going to try their best to keep going. You have to think this is going to have a major negative impact on players going to the Olympics. Obviously, there's still plenty of time to make decisions on this. They don't have to rush by any means, but with the Chinese government's rules right now, if a player goes over to Beijing for the Olympics and tests positive, they could be in isolation over there for up to 5 weeks. It's a 3 to 5 weeks, and I believe after 3 weeks, you're allowed to do your tests. At that point, you have to produce 2 negative tests before you can be released. And right now, they're not going to be allowed to have any type of medical evacuations either. So imagine if we're near the end of the Olympics and the NHL players are leaving Beijing when you get left behind in China on your own for an extra 3 weeks having to quarantine. I mean, that's not really an ideal situation. The NHL has a rule in place this year. If you miss time due to COVID, there's a lot of rules that they wouldn't necessarily have to be paid, where that's kind of outside of the league situation there. So, I mean, they could be losing money. They could be away from their families for an extended time in a foreign country that's not exactly on great diplomatic terms with Canada and the U.S. and many other countries elsewhere. I think that not only the virus is having an impact on the decision, but I think a lot of it has to do with the location as well. If the Olympics were being held in North America or in, say, somewhere in Scandinavian part of Europe, like, Norway, Sweden, France, England, like anywhere where it's, better relations, I wouldn't be surprised if there'd be, less stress around, sending these players and the players wanting to go. But ultimately, they're going to try their best to leave this up to the players. But if the league gets shut down, too many teams, and it gets really spiraling out of control, the league does have an option to pull the plug. But they're trying their best not to do that. They're trying to let it be to, have the players decide. But to have that many players in one short span go into COVID protocol today, the Canes are in rough shape now, the Flames, and you got like the Oilers, Bruins, Avalanche, Canucks all having a touch of a few things, and that all means that they could be at risk for more positive tests. It could get real ugly real fast, and that's just how this virus works and what we've seen. We've seen situations around the world can change very rapidly. We've heard word as well from top doctors in the province of Ontario saying that there's likely some rule changes coming in the province of Ontario as early as the end of this week, which they may be putting limits on large gatherings. So we might see the Maple Leafs and the Senators not be allowed to go to 100% attendance capacity for their games any longer for at least a period of time. So that could be an impact too. So we'll have to see what comes from that. We'll have to see what comes from this meeting that's taking place tonight and see what happens. But certainly a very interesting situation that's very, impactful here. And we just hope that everybody can stay safe and get through this season. And like I said, though, there's lots of things that can be impacted. And my gut feeling says the odds of the NHL players going to the Olympics now is extremely slim. I don't think that really makes a lot of sense. I understand why they want to go completely. It just seems like there's an awful lot of risk associated to going. So we'll see where this goes and watch the situation. Of course, the World Juniors are not too far away. Of course, they always get started on Boxing Day. So players from those countries are going to be arriving in Alberta and Canada for the tournament here soon to complete their quarantine period as they're prepared for this tournament. And hopefully that can go off without too many issues as well. Obviously, they have a lot of history now and recent success in hosting these tournaments without minimal impacts when it comes to health and safety and COVID and all that. So hopefully that tournament can get off without any issues. But on to some other news. The Red Wings have re-signed forward Robbi Fabbri to a 3-year contract extension. Of course, he was picked up from the St. Louis Blues a couple seasons back. Since he's arrived in Detroit, he's been their third highest scoring forward. He gets a 3-year deal at $4 million a year. So to me, that's a pretty decent contract. You could maybe say it's a little bit of an overpayment, but not too drastically. But he's fit in well with their young core. And obviously played a good role for them. I know early in Fabbri's career, he was, having a lot of injury issues. That he had some major knee surgeries where he missed an entire complete season, parts of others, and it was really looking like his career may never get on track. So the past couple of years that he's been in Detroit, the fact he's been able to stay healthy is certainly great to see, and hopefully he can carry on and earn this contract and continue developing. I think a part of this contract, I think it's fair to say, is they're expecting him to take some more steps forward and kind of realize some more untapped potential that we haven't seen yet, because based on his past history, I certainly deserves an extension. I think it's a great piece there. I just think $4 million might be a little bit of an overpayment, but if he improves further, maybe it won't be. Now, one other couple notes here out of Dallas today. Ben Bishop, as we talked about before, basically officially announced his retirement. It was a very emotional press conference he held today. Obviously, he was not going to be officially retired until his contract expires, because he will remain a long-term injury reserve since it's a hockey-related injury that's causing him to be, not being able to play. It only makes sense he collect his paycheck, because that's why that's there, for insurance. So essentially, Big Ben had thanked a lot of people and talked about his career, reminisced a little bit, and certainly, like I said, shed some tears as he kind of acknowledged that his playing days are officially over due to a degenerative knee issue. And of course, his former tandem mate here, Anton Khudobin, cleared waivers today. Nobody picked him up, and I think a large part of that is the fact that he still has another year left on his contract. at almost $3.5 million, which is certainly the stumbling block here. So it has been reported that the Stars did have trade talks around him before putting on waivers. They just never really got anywhere close to getting a deal done and never got anything really remotely interesting in a trade offer. So they decided to go down this road. I know many feel that there's still a possibility he could be traded, but it's going to increase now that he's cleared waivers. It's expected that many teams also did say to Dallas that they'd really like to see him play a little bit more before making the acquisition, and this gives him a chance to go down and play in their AHL team instead of in the NHL, where they've been giving all the games to either Ottinger or Holtby, and they don't really want to give the net to Khudobin right now. So this allows him to go down there, hopefully dominate a few games, get some interest, and I think the Stars would likely end up having to retain some salary. So if you just pick him up on waivers, you get the contract as is. But if you can, kind of push the negotiations here a little bit, you could kind of entice Dallas to have to retain some salary in order to make a deal happen. But there's teams out there that would be interested. They've seen what he could do in the bubble playoffs here a couple of years ago. I think there's still lots of game left in Khudobin. Outside of this year, his stats have been good. So I think in the right situation, he could possibly thrive. But it's just, it's the risk, right? That extra year. So they can get some salary retained if they can retain 25-30% and knock that down to, maybe 2-point-something million. Then that's a little bit more attractive, a little bit less risky, and we'll likely see something take place from there. But there's certainly interested teams, there was no doubt. It's just a matter of the price and the asking price to get it done. So we'll see if anything happens with him now that he's cleared, and hopefully he can play soon and gain some attention. Now, a couple of things I want to talk about when it comes to some potential trade players. One thing I want to touch on quickly is a few names that were mentioned in an article that we discussed just a few days ago, which was the new Jeff Merrick blog from Sportsnet called Rink Fries, where he put out about his trade bait board of the 25 most likely players to be dealt before the deadline. We talked about a bunch of those names, but there's a few I just wanted to touch on here quickly, that there's still, some big names that could be moved that are pending UFAs and some that are not. So the pending UFAs are John Klingberg and Philip Forsberg. I mean, there's still no word of a contract extension for either of these guys right now with their respective teams. Of course, Klingberg with the Dallas Stars, Forsberg with the Nashville Predators. When it comes to Klingberg, like I said, there's certainly interest from both sides to remain with the Stars. However, it's just going to be pretty much impossible cap-wise if he doesn't bring his price down. And at this point, he's played well and had a solid career. He's getting into his late 20s. He's looking for around $8 million a year on a long-term deal. And I just don't see any way that the Dallas Stars can afford to make that happen without shipping out some other players and cutting down their salary, which is going to be extremely challenging to do. So will they go down that road? They've already got Brodin. They've already got Dumba. They signed Ryan Suter. And also creates an extremely expensive blue line. Mind you, an effective blue line that could be really good for them as well. But still, that's a ton of dough tied up in a few players there, and I just don't see it happening. We had word before that the Hurricanes were a team that were very interested in Klingberg as a rental, where he could land long-term and sign a new contract, assuming he hits free agency, is really difficult to say right now. There would be a big market for him, though, especially considering there's not a ton of UFA defensemen that are really capable of what he's doing that's going to be on the market possibly next offseason. So he could be a big player at the rental at the deadline, and he could also be a big name to watch in free agency this year. Like I said, there's just not a ton of higher end talent in that regard that likely is to come available. When it comes to Forsberg with the Predators, again, they're a team that's difficult to kind of predict right now. Dallas falls into that same category because they're very much kind of in the mix still. It's still early. Lots of time here before we get to that point in the season where teams kind of need to decide if they're a buyer, seller, or what they're going to do heading in towards the end of the year into the deadline. But of course, again, Forsberg to me is a player that the Predators probably would be interested in, but does it make sense for them to hand out another longer-term contract on a player who's, not necessarily past his prime, but for the bulk of the contract would be the latter part of the prime and into past the prime when they already have guys like Johansson and Duchesne and Yossi and all these other players that they have on longer-term deals. If they need more of a rebuild, that's going to prove difficult to do, and it might not make a lot of sense. So obviously, many look at how David Poile handles this contract as a major signal on what direction a team will go into the future beyond this year. And, could they do a rebuild? At this point, I wouldn't say that's too likely. It might be more of a reset, if anything, depending on how the rest of the year goes. They certainly have some good pieces there, but they're in a real tough division. There's a lot of extracurricular stuff having an impact on teams like COVID, especially in injuries, and it just might not be the most, some of these teams are just hard to predict right now is basically what I'm getting at. So what Forsberg's future holds is difficult to say, but those are the two of the top players, in my opinion, that are pending UFAs to watch going to the deadline. We know the Tarasenko situation in St. Louis seems to be a little bit of tension appeared between Rumours and Tarasenko, kind of starting back up again. Tarasenko started the year real strong, but it has very much since cooled off. We also still very much know that trade request that he put to the Blues is still very much on the table. And of course, with the Blues, had a hot start. And again, they're still in the mix though, so they probably don't really want to trade Tarasenko if they're trending towards being a playoff team, unless they can get something back of similar value that they feel they're not going to be a weaker team. So I still think he's a player very much to watch. We know Doug Armstrong is not afraid to be aggressive. He's made big moves before, even when they were trending towards being a playoff team. So again, another guy that I think in the first few weeks of the year, we're like, oh yeah, that trade request probably isn't going to get fulfilled now. He's playing well. The Blues are winning. That's not going to happen maybe next offseason. But now things have kind of changed a bit, and it wouldn't be surprising to see that be revisited, especially knowing that he still very much has that trade request on the table. And when it comes to the Habs, we've talked a lot about a variety of guys who could be moved out starting at the deadline. The rest could be moved in the offseason, depending on their contracts and their, attractiveness to other teams going towards the playoffs. But one player we haven't talked a lot about would be Tyler Toffoli. I mean, when he first signed to Montreal, I'm sure he didn't envision a situation where the team was likely heading towards a rebuild. Last year, his very first season was spectacular. He had a real solid year, scored at an extremely high rate. Team goes to the finals. Everything's trending upwards. And now look at this year. It's an absolute disaster with the whole team kind of, potentially being ripped apart here. And a lot of pieces already gone due to injuries. A lot of other players rumored to be on the move too. And he very well could be a guy that's attractive. He's got Stanley Cup pedigree after winning a cup before in LA. A guy who's a proven scorer. So I can see there being some interest in him as well. Even though he does have more term in his contract, it's not like it's a big, $9, $10, $11 million contract. He's only making, in that 4 range. It's a lot more affordable. And I can see there being interest in him as well. And lastly, I want to touch on the Islanders. Just listening to the most recent edition of the Cold Stove podcast that came out earlier today, listening to Brett Merriman and NRD talk about the Islanders, and I had a big rant on the Islanders situation, talking about the fact that they feel that really Lou Lamoriello is really largely responsible for this team not being successful this year. The fact that they're an older, slow team, and that he should have seen this coming. And even though he did a great job and has done a lot of good things with his team in the past couple of years, that this is largely on him for not addressing the fairly obvious issues this past offseason. He did a great job opening up cap space and dumping some bad contracts. Like he moved the Nick Leddy contract. He moved Andrew Ladd. Like he did a lot of things that were not easy to do, but seemed impossible, and he proved that they were possible. But then with that newfound cap space and things that he was able to open up, he didn't really put it to good use. They didn't address the fact that they needed a Nick Leddy replacement after moving him. So that blue line is largely missing that. They have Andy Green and Zdeno Chara. A lot of respect for Chara, but he's certainly lost a step. He's not the same defenseman. Between those two guys, it's a lot of age back there, a lot of grayness in the beard, and they're not playing strong enough to really justify their roles anymore. They seem to be very, very reluctant on giving young guys an opportunity. Like we saw the other day that Anthony Beauvillier was mentioned in a trade rumor. He was healthy scratch. Some question about his future in Long Island, and really should not really even be the case. He's one of the few players that are still in his early 20s with all the older guys that they have there. They have a lot of players over the age of 30 signed long term, so it's not going to be easy to shake things up. They talked also about in this segment here on the podcast about how Jordan Eberle, even though many felt that contract needed to go heading into the last offseason, that even though he didn't score a ton of goals, he was big in the locker room, and that he also scored important goals at key times, and they're missing that as well. Barzal has not been quite the same effective player this year, and certainly some concern with all the aging players ahead of Barzal age-wise, that, when his contract comes due, are we going to have a situation like we had with Tavares? Is he going to want to stick around if this team can't make some changes? So obviously NRD really feels like there's a really good chance that we're going to see something significant here come out of the Islanders, and that we could see a big trade. He didn't really have any rumors to suggest what players exactly are going to be on the hook here, but really, if you look at Lou, he brought in guys that he's all familiar with, and he needs to kind of do what's best for the team. Like, he brought in Palmieri, he brought in Parise, like the Chera and Green. Like, that's just not getting it done. They need to rely more on their youth and develop here, and we're not seeing a change in, how they're attacking this lost season, you could call it right now. And Barry Trotz, to me, part of the problem too. But I think a lot of this is on Lou and roster construction. They need to go out and make some deals and make them quick here. They were previously linked to Vladimir Tarasenko, as I mentioned with St. Louis. Will they revisit that? They were after Jacob Chychrun with the Coyotes, but of course they were told that that was a basically non-touchable. It wasn't happening, non-starter for them. But they do need to find a defenseman to replace those minutes that Nick Leddy was playing. There's a variety of names that have been linked to this team all season. Could they go after Klingberg? Probably not. I mean, I don't know if they can make that work money-wise, but there's certainly lots of other D-men out there that they can go after. They need a scorer, and they need to do something, and they need to do it quick. It's hard to imagine with a brand new building and all these losses and the good ownership guys that they have there. Like, they need to do something quick. I mean, and might, even though Lou Lamoriello has been back-to-back years of GM of the year, he could go from being back-to-back GM of the year to being ousted, really, if they don't do something to get things turned around. So according to NRD, he feels big things are coming for the Islanders and expects some big trades. I wouldn't be shocked if Bailey was mentioned or involved in a deal. He was rumored to be heavily involved in some trade talks that were also going on this past offseason, and there's some others out there as well. But they need to find a way to get some youth and some more speed and skill into this lineup, because if you look at the prospect cupboard, it's not even all that full. There is some interesting names in there, guys that could be NHL players, but there's nothing like super high-end that's really going to be coming to save today anytime soon. So if you think about it, with an aging team, that just does not a good recipe for success. If they don't win this year or next year, they could be in a situation where we're heading back to the dark days. Basically is what he put it at on the podcast. A brand new building, and you just don't have the players anymore once some of these guys start to get even beyond and get worse as they age a few more years down the road. So we'll see what Lou does, but he's going to do something here to try to save this season and get this team turned around. Let me know your thoughts on everything discussed today down in the comments. We'll discuss further. If you're new to this channel, make sure you subscribe and stick around. We'll keep you up to date with all the latest news, rumors, and analysis on all 32 NHL teams. Thank you for watching, and I'll catch you next time.